Duck hunting has been a recreational activity for Australians since the first days of white settlement. It has always been extremely popular in the southern states, where vast areas of marsh and wetlands abounded. Huge populations of waterfowl provided sport and nutritious food for the hunter prepared to take the effort to bag a duck. After each of the two world wars, the Australian government issued land parcels to returning servicemen, the soldier settlement blocks. This resulted in a large increase of land clearing and wetland drainage. In 1958, a Victorian government department released a report which stated that the Pacific black duck, our premier game bird, could be extinct in 10 to 12 years. At that time, nobody knew why. There were no conservation departments, scientific research units, or regulatory impact statements. This report so horrified duck hunters that a public meeting was called in Sale by a group of concerned and visionary hunter conservationists. The purpose of the meeting was to form a body which would lobby government to set up a research department to find out why the black duck populations had declined so much. On June 26, 1958, the meeting was held in St Mary's Cathedral Hall in Sale for the purpose of forming a Victorian Game Bird Association. Some 80 people attended, including Mr Max Downs, biologist of the Fisheries and Games Department. The meeting was chaired by Mr Jeff Cole, Vice President of the Gippsland Angling Clubs Association. He spoke of the advantages which could be gained by field sportsmen banding together to present a united voice on matters concerning field shooting and game management. Seeing as hunter conservationists were concerned about the plight of the black duck, they called themselves the Victorian Field and Game Association. The meeting adopted resolutions designed to develop Victorian facilities for game bird hunting by the promotion of game bird conservation and management projects. They also wanted to develop a greater public appreciation of the pleasures and values of game bird hunting. The first committee was formed with President Dr Hugh Martin of Yarram and Secretary Mr Herb Guyatt of Sale. And so the Victorian Field and Game Association was born. The fledgling VF and GA asked the government to tax the hunter in the form of a game licence, which at that time did not exist. In addition to raising money for game management, the association would then have had a voice with the government on the needs of the hunter and game bird conservation in Victoria. Sir Henry Bolte was the Premier at that time, and being a keen hunter himself, he joined the association and granted it its request. In 1959, a hunting licence which cost £1 was introduced. In its first year, it raised £34,500 for the Wildlife Management Fund. With this revenue, the government instructed the Fisheries and Game Department to immediately set about pinpointing the reason for the black duck's decline. The reason turned out to be as a result of the massive drainage programs taking place across the state. The small shallow lignum and kumbungi swamps were the easiest to drain, and therefore they were the first to go. This was the prime black duck nesting habitat. With this problem recognised, and with the continuing revenue from hunting licences, the department set about buying private wetlands so as to conserve remaining wetland habitats. The year 1959 was an important one to the new association. A presentation given at the February meeting by Mr Max Downs advised the members to concentrate their efforts for a start on 3 specific areas rather than try to have improvements made all over the state. The areas he suggested were Jack Smith Lake in Gippsland, Winton Swamp in the northeast and Tower Hill in the west. Other important happenings for 1959 were the adoption of formal constitution, the Game Shooters News Handbook was introduced and contained contributions from the Field and Game Association. The Victorian Governor, Major General Sir Rowan Delacombe, and Victorian Premier Sir Henry Bolte became patrons of the association. The then Fisheries and Game Department Director, Mr Dunbaven Butcher, spoke at an association meeting for the first time, thus commencing a long relationship between government and the association. The Fisheries and Game Department purchased land near Werribee, which is now Serendip Research Station, and land at Kerrang for the Kurangi Research Station. Sir Henry Bolte passed far-thinking legislation which created the Game Reserve and Refuge system. The idea was to create a series of wetland systems across Victoria which would continue to support breeding populations of water birds. Essential to this was to ensure that hunters had sufficient areas and opportunities to hunt, otherwise the funding base would disappear and no land could be bought or managed. The first Victorian State Game Reserve was Jack Smith's Lake near Woodside, and the second was Lake Coleman near Sale. Tower Hill also became a State Game Reserve. By March 1960, VF and GA had listed 40 key areas as the start of the Game Reserve system throughout Victoria. Not all field and game efforts were directed to areas where shooting in season was permitted. The classic example is Sale Common, an area of some 700 acres, which for years had been exploited by cattle dealers and bogus leases. Field and Game made representation to have this area declared a wildlife sanctuary, and today it stands as a monument to Field and Game, and has since 1963. Today, there are now over 1 million hectares of wetlands managed by Parks Victoria, all due to a concerned group of duck hunters. It didn't stop there. With the black duck problem recognised and efforts being made to ensure its future, hunters all over the state began to form together into Field and Game branches so as to do something in their local area. It was all very similar to the current land care movement, small groups of concerned citizens banding together to save their local wetlands. The only difference then was that all these people were duck hunters. Most of these hunters had only just emerged from the horrors of the Second World War and Korea. They were hard-working, honest and down-to-earth Australians who had an affinity with the land and nature. They were in fact the first wetland conservation movement in Victoria. During the ensuing years, many things to do with wildlife conservation were instigated and dealt with. At some stage or another, probably every wetland area in the state of Victoria has been mentioned in the Field and Game minutes. Barmah Forest first appeared in the minutes in 1962, Lake Condah in 1967, the diversion of Merriman's Creek into Lake Reeve in 1962, the Ibis Rookery near Kerrang in 1965, and Water for Herds and Johnson's Swamps in 1968. By 1963, concern was being expressed about the numbers of chestnut teal in coastal regions. There had been relatively little swamp drainage in some of these areas, and the wetlands were safe, but the numbers of chestnut teal seemed to be declining. It was known that the chestnut, like most other ducks, nested in hollow branches or logs. Land clearance for farming and firewood had taken the prime nesting habitat away, and in many cases had cleared the land right to the water's edge. In some areas the nesting habitat of the chestnut teal had all but disappeared. In the USA, the North Carolina wood duck had suffered the same problem, and had tinkered on the edge of extinction. A huge program of erecting artificial nest boxes on poles or wired to existing trees began in the late 1930s. It had brought the woody populations back to levels where they were secure. It was thought that nest boxes may work for the chestnut teal. The VF and GA sourced a seemingly never-ending supply of wooden ammunition boxes from the Army, and in later years PVC drums were used. These were sent to branches where holes were put in the front and tin roofs attached. They were erected on poles or wired into trees. Gippsland was the original area targeted for this experiment because of the ideal wetland habitat and declining population of chestnut teal. The nest boxes worked. Chestnut teal took to them like fish to water, and the nest box program boomed. It stretched all along the southern coast from Orbost in the east to the South Australian border. In a short number of years, the chestnut teal made a great comeback, and the nest box program continues to this day in Field and Game. It is estimated that approximately 35,000 of these boxes have been erected over the ensuing years. In the early 1970s, the VF and GA had branches in all areas of Victoria and thousands of members. Branches were keen, enthusiastic, and now flush with their own funds. Buoyed with success of the habitat protection work that had been achieved, the association went on the offensive against habitat destruction. Field and Game Australia now has branches in 4 states and 2 territories of Australia. There were many reasons why hunters joined Field and Game.
So I originally joined Field and Game in Geelong, actually. I started my association in Geelong in 1964 as an inaugural member, then became secretary and went to the council meetings in Melbourne at the Commercial Travellers Association, and from there went through the office chain and become secretary and president a couple of times, and gained a lot out of Field and Game over the years, especially the friendships and the communication between groups of people. You can go anywhere in the state, even to now, or through Australia, and find friendship and people of like mind, and that's one of the highlights of that I believe Field and Game has, besides all the good work that's been carried out over the years, is the fact that you can go anywhere and meet with likewise people and speak a common interest, and that's been one of the highlights of my time in Field and Game.
Well, my days go back to 1958 when the Shepparton Game Association was formed, following what happened in Sale earlier in that year. And I became a member then, and that membership continued through, and then I became part of the Shepparton executive, and back in those days they had what they called, which was formed, the Goulburn Murray region, which took in all the branches in the Goulburn Murray region, which I became secretary, then president, and then followed through to become was asked to stand for president in 1973 of the association.
I think the shooting of it, the outdoor shooting in the first place, I know at that time Geelong never had a big profile, but I happened to be invited to a fox shoot on that particular weekend, and the Geelong secretary at that stage of the game stood up on a tank stand and said, if you're not a Field and Game member, you're not going out there shooting. And so I signed up that day.
In my young days, I lived in the Bendigo area and I was keen on duck hunting. After I left school and eventually in 1960 got a job at Ford in Geelong and wasn't very involved in shooting because I didn't have contacts. And then in the early 60s I heard about Field and Game and went along to the Geelong branch and led to a long period of involvement with Field and Game. It continued until this day.
Well, I was a pretty keen knockabout hunter and fisherman, and a good fisherman friend of mine took me to a Field and Game meeting one night, and within the space of 12 months I found I wasn't just a member, I was the secretary of the local Geelong branch, and it all took off from there.
My first trip to a Field and Game ground was at Listerfield, solely for the purpose of walking Labrador pups around behind all the guns to get them used to the gunfire. I think I made at least six to eight visits to Listerfield before I ever took a gun along with me.
Anywhere it looked like a wetland would be in danger from a drainage scheme, sometimes government sanctioned, development or private individual, the V, F and GA rallied to its defence. Submissions were written, meetings attended, and politicians were lobbied in attempts to save wetland after wetland. Many hours and hardships were endured to get these wins. Notable among them was the purchase of Dowd's Morass after a long drawn-out campaign, the goodwill generated by the association donating $3,500 towards the purchase of part of the Hart Morass State Game Reserve, the provision in law for water to be provided for flora and fauna, the first environmental water allocations, the acceptance of VFGA by such statutory authorities as the State Rivers and Water Supply Commission, which led to their representatives being present at all meetings, the acceptance of association evidence at the various parliamentary inquiries and land conservation studies, and many others. Saving Gemmell's Swamp, Mooroopna, and its ibis rookery from destruction for a proposed speedboat complex.
I can remember when Des Thomas rang up to say we've won, but the hours and fights that and the publicity that happened throughout the Murray-Goulburn area, particularly Shepparton, and I know at my time, and I only found out years later, that the local, one of the local councillors that were pushing for the water ski area of Gemmell Swamp actually went to my employer to say, get him to shut up, or can't you get rid of him? So I learnt that later. So it was quite a dogfight in those days, but it was a win. And I can recall going to South Africa, where I read where there was a rookery in the middle of Pretoria, and to make our point was to find that water birds and wildlife can live within built-up areas and still maintain their, as long as the habitat's maintained, the birds will survive. And that was one of the main arguments we put. So when that win comes through, it was a great achievement, I believe, to all those people in the Shepparton area and the association, and in particular, one past member of Shepparton was Kevin Dunn, who fought very well in those days, and he was a vice president of the association for a number of years.
The association was very proud that two former presidents, Dr. Hugh Martin and Doug Hemingway, were honoured with the MBE in the New Year's Honours List, and their work for conservation was a feature of the awards. In 1967, the association was accepted as a member of the Australian Conservation Foundation, and in 1970, the Field and Game Association joined the newly formed Conservation Council of Victoria as a full member. It was the only hunter organisation in the council. The CCV was the coordinating body for the amateur conservation movement in Victoria. The 1970s arrived. The Vietnam War had finished, and the youth revolution of the 1960s was over. It was the era of protest and demonstration. An entire generation of young people with an abundance of energy and wanting to be a part of something turned towards nature, and the new conservation movement was born. Field and Game was part of it right from the start. The VF and GA President, Phil Brown, was elected President of the Conservation Council of Victoria, recognition of the association's standing in the conservation movement.
The 60s, there was a huge conservation battle developed over the proposal to clear large areas of the Little Desert for agriculture. And all of the conservation groups got together at that stage to fight that proposal, and Field and Game was involved in that as well, because by that stage Field and Game had established it, although a hunting organisation, had established itself as one of the leading practical conservation groups in the state. The Conservation Council of Victoria was formed of all the major conservation groups at that stage. Because Field and Game were so involved in conservation, I was elected president, and I spent about 6 years as president, and I then was on the member of the Conservation Council executive for about another 6 or 7 years. Then it became more a greenie organisation, and I didn't want a bar of that, and moved out. I had plenty of other activities on my plate.
In 1978, VF and GA was awarded the Victorian Government's prestigious Conservation Prize for the organisation that had done the most work for conservation in Victoria, recognising its work in wetland protection and rehabilitation. The award was presented to Mr John Foster, the then VF and GA State President.
At the time, being accepted by the conservation people, Phil Brown was actually one of the presidents of the Conservation Council of Victoria, and that was almost unheard of in those days, that a hunter would be leading a conservation group. We did actually win the Conservation Council Prize for Victoria, and that was for wetland conservation over the previous 5 years. And that was a very, very highly acceptable thing to the public, I believe.
During the early 80s and 90s, reformist Labor governments were elected to power in nearly every Australian state, as well as federally. The decade of the greenie, animal rights activists and gun controllers had arrived. It was a period of affluence. It was also a period of increasing urbanisation of the Australian population, with many Australians losing contact with the country, its culture and its values. Science, logic, game management principles, and plain common sense were thrown away and replaced with ideology. News media sought only sensationalism, and the era of the talkback personality who tried to make the news with their own opinions instead of reporting the facts was upon us. Worst of all, the Kane government of Victoria abolished the Wildlife Management Fund, and all revenue from hunters and shooters licence fees went straight into consolidated revenue.
And I can tell you, a lot of people are going to have to work very hard to convince me and other ministers that should continue, I would think. And what's the difference between that and hunting foxes? Probably worse.
Funding for wetland purchase and management all but dried up. The Hoddle Street and Queen Street tragedies, gun control campaigns and anti-hunting groups compounded to force the VF and GA to drop most of its conservation efforts. The association found itself fighting for its own survival instead of the survival of the wetlands and water birds. During this period of neglect, many of our wetlands suffered and died. VF and GA recognised the need for trained media spokespersons and put core members through media training courses. This resulted in a public relations officer being appointed in 1984.
Once you have become a good hunter, you've obviously become a good naturalist. You're probably one of the worst greenies there is on earth.
As far as scaring birds go, well, it really doesn't work, because the Light Aircraft Club fly around here all the time and the birds just get up and land again.
Media were invited to wetland rehabilitation working bees and nest box days. Special briefing events were held, and a rapport with journalists and media outlets was gained. When anti-hunting and anti-gun groups tried to run media articles, The VF&GA was now being approached for their views. Some balance was being restored to the debate. During all this time, Field and Game tried to continue with its wetland conservation efforts. The 1980s was also a decade that saw a public relations exercise succeed and 2 major wetland projects completed. In 1982, a film about Cullens Lake, Kerrang, was produced and was broadcast on Melbourne's Channel 10 TV network as a community service announcement. The film was designed to stop Cullens Lake being turned into a salt evaporation basin. This was hugely successful, and the attention it received from the public helped save Cullens Lake.
When I was president, we flew to Kerrang with the then Minister Bill Borthwick and Director Jim Wharton, and we visited the lakes in Kerrang, and we went to Cullens Lake. And Cullens Lake was absolutely full at that time and magnificent, and it was flooded with tens of thousands of wildlife birds, and we couldn't work out how we could show the director the absolute value of Cullens Lake. And while we were standing there was a clap of thunder, and the clap of thunder brought the whole lake to life. All the birds rose about 50 feet in the air and circled and went down again. I think it was Jim Wharton that said there must be at least 2 million. We didn't change his mind, of course, but that was one of the funny times that happened.
A major wetland project carried out by the Geelong branch came to fruition when the hospital swamp was opened on the 17th of April 1982. This was the start of an ongoing wetland project and resulted in the much larger effort of restoring and managing the entire Reedy Lake system.
The strength of my own club at Geelong is there's some 700 members there, and they come from all walks of life. Myself a surveyor, but we've got engineers, we've got carpenters, we've got bricklayers, concreters, you name it, Field and Game's got it. And when you've got an engineering project to do, you only have to ask and you will get those tradespeople and professionals along to help. And that's one of the real strengths of Field and Game, is hunting cuts across the whole social spectrum. You've got people from all walks of life who are interested and who are passionate, and they're prepared to put their time and effort into wetland conservation projects, put their materials, their money and their staff into making these projects work. Hospital Swamps was the largest of those, or the first of those that I took on, and one of the largest, which involved 2 or 3 kilometres of channels and regulating structures, etc., to bring water from the Barwon River across to a swamp system that was otherwise isolated, really restoring the natural flows, which was what it was about. And way back in 1982, we delivered that project. It was a $10,000 budget, but if we costed what it would have been to do it with fully contracted resources, it was a $30,000 project. Very good example of the practical contribution that the hunting movement, Field and Game, can make to wetland conservation. That was only the first project, and that was back in 1982, 83 we did that one. We've had 10 years of restoring the biggest freshwater wetland in southern Victoria, Reedy Lake, just across the river from the hospital swamp system.
A major part of this management project was the protection of the wetland from invasion by European carp, an exercise that continues to this day.
We've been fighting European carp in that river system since 1979. We were the first to establish they were in the river system, and we watched our magnificent Reedy Lake decline for a number of years. In 1996, I think we were able to initially get consent to do something about saving that lake. By that stage, virtually all the aquatic vegetation had gone, all the water birds had gone other than the fish-eating species. The lake was in crisis. And over a period 1997 to even now, we're still very active on this. We've been able to drain the lake for the first time in 30 years, kill off tens of thousands of European carp, build new inlet channels, new outlet channels, control structures, carp screens, brought in the Snobs Creek experts to give us a model for the repopulation of carp, how quickly they'd regrow in the lake system, developed water management plans around that, had a look at groundwater salinity, brought all those things together to develop a new water management plan for that lake. The lake has never looked better.
On May 24, 1988, the Dowds Morass Regulator was officially opened. This was the end of a 20-year dream that Field and Game had to provide water from the Latrobe River and ensure the 3,689 acres of wetland habitat in the Dowds Morass State Game Reserve. This work was carried out by the Gippsland region of Field and Game, and many members donated man-hours and money to the project. Heard's and Johnson's swamps in the Kerrang area were wetlands that demanded a lot of the association's attention, and the fight to save them and get a guaranteed water allocation was a success. The permanent environmental water allocation for Heard's is believed to be the first in Australia. Those wetlands, along with others, were saved. Proof of the continuing conservation work of Field and Game came when Phil Brown, ex-president and life member, was awarded the OAM in 1985.
I got a letter on the picked up mail on a Friday night before I went to Mildura for the state, or for the national championships, simulated field championships. And that letter was from Canberra saying that I had been nominated for an award and would I accept. You can imagine how I felt, but I couldn't tell anybody until it was announced on Australia Day the next year. And going to Mildura and spending that weekend of the championships with people I knew and trying to keep quiet was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do.
Further evidence of the continuing conservation work of Field and Game was that another ex-president and life member, Des Thomas, was also awarded the OAM in 1988. Both of these awards, bestowed upon these two men, were a reflection of their and Field and Game's relentless work in protecting and saving the state's wetlands and waterbirds. All while the new animal rights movement was trying to ban duck hunting. One of the other great achievements of Field and Game in the 1980s was the repeal of the law that banned hunting on Sundays.
The Sunday shooting laws had always been a bee in my bonnet. From the day I became an apprentice butcher and we were living in Melbourne, the only chance I had was to finish work really, really quick, hop in the car, drive all the way to Benalla to go out on Lake McCowan for the evening hunt. And then you had to sleep in your sleeping bag the next day. I could never fathom why you could go to horse races or football matches or car races. I could never fathom why I couldn't go duck hunting or any sort of hunting on Sunday. And it had been tried over the years, but basically it had been a letter written by an organisation somewhere and they got a reply and that was the end of it. And I remember sitting at a state council meeting, I think Gary Howard was president, and I mentioned about what's happening about Sunday shooting. And I was given the answer, and I said, well, why isn't this done and why isn't that done and why isn't it a 5-year program? And that's how I got on the State Executive Field and Game, because Gary Howard then said, well, would you like to help us out and get involved in that? And so I did, and I ended up on the State Executive then, and my 5-year plan to get Sunday shooting implemented, finished 3 years later when we got Sunday shooting made legal.
As far back as 1979, the VF and GA president, Jack Foster, had called for the need for a paid administrator. This came to fruition in the late 80s, when Field and Game opened its first national office in Geelong. It was first staffed by Kerry McLaughlin, who was later joined by Alan Graham.
The burden on volunteers to administer an organisation that size was not sustainable. We established an office in Geelong. We brought in a paid chief executive officer. We brought in paid administration staff. The benefits of professionalising the administration, we were able to produce, for instance, publish annual reports that brought together all of the conservation, hunting, target shooting activities of the association, quantify the contributions of those activities to wetland conservation, count the number of foxes that were taken on fox drives by all our various clubs, pull all that together and publish a document that gave us initially baseline data from which we could grow the association, but also gave us information that we could sell ourselves to government and government agencies, so they could see we weren't all talk, we were doing things.
In 1997, the national office moved to Seymour, and Rod Drew was appointed the executive officer. In 2002, the organisation had outgrown the premises and moved to a larger building. The association now had 5 full-time staff. Some regard the association's move to professionalism as one of its greatest achievements.
The fact that we now have a paid executive, paid staff, and the fact that our profile has been lifted in the media.
The fact that it's now recognised by the government is prepared to listen to it, and that's due to the people, I suppose, in our organisation that hold the board positions.
So the greatest achievement for me in my era would be the move towards a more professional organisation with better communications to members, better communications to the media, and better communications to politicians, government departments and people of influence.
I think obviously it's becoming a more professional organisation and moving into the political arena where we now have some political influence. I do believe that that's actually what saved the association. Without that, I think we probably wouldn't have survived this long.
By the mid-90s, the sensationalism of the anti-hunting demonstrations had become boring. Field and Game took this opportunity to launch its own street theatre tactics that were designed to take the perceived seriousness out of the debate and show up the whole anti-hunting campaign as a media circus. Advertisements were placed in newspapers advertising for Spitfire pilots to fly combat air patrol against non-meat-eating terrorists. Talkback Radio was full of interviews with Wing Commander Sir Geoffrey Lancaster Smythe, VC.
And what it says is a fight fire with fire move. Duck shooters today introduced a fictitious character supposedly forming an anti-animal liberation air force. But the bizarre stunt hides a serious message from duck hunters.
Air Commodore Sir Geoffrey Lancaster Smythe is a hoax and proud of it. He claims to have been commissioned by the Victorian Field and Game Association to form an air force. The target, animal liberationists trying to disrupt next month's duck season opening.
Terrorist suburbanites who don't eat meat and don't believe anyone else should, and therefore trying to destroy a total Australian tradition.
Sir Geoffrey is really Graham Eames, a devoted shooter and former officer of the Field and Game Association. He placed this advertisement in today's Sun because he believes shooters should use stunts like the animal liberationists. Sir Geoffrey may be a joke, but his message is serious.
They had to take the whole debate as a big joke. It's a load of rubbish, a load of rot and a load of piffle, and we've just seen too much of the one side of the piffle over the last 4 years.
The Field and Game Association will launch a counter-offensive on opening day. It'll use boats and foot patrols to shadow animal liberation protesters. And volunteer pilots and planes, maybe even a Spitfire, will monitor animal liberation planes. But ironically, Sir Geoffrey will not be involved in the flying patrols. This is the closest he's been to a cockpit. He wouldn't even know how to start a plane, let alone fly one. Nick McCallum for the 10 Evening News.
A navy was launched for the media with Rear Admiral Thomas William Nautilus III at the helm, and the powerful PT-73 gunboat patrolled the Yarra River for the assembled media and dealt with anti-hunting demonstrators.
Victoria's duck hunters have launched a naval assault on animal liberationists. With just a week to go before the duck season opens, the shooters have staged a mock battle to show off their firepower. Brian Schrouder reports.
The war games were complete with duck shooters, animal libbers, and the all-new anti-animal libber frigate. Its mission to blast protesters out of the water. Despite their humour, the Field and Game Association shares protesters' concerns that lives may be risked in an opening day confrontation.
If you're a protester and you intend to be on our wetlands on duck opening morning and you insist on putting yourself at life and risk and you could hurt yourself, then we're just saying you're a bloody idiot.
And shooters warn that animal libbers will copper spray from their gunboat. This is Brian Schrouder for the 10 Evening News.
A land army was being called up to do battle with anti-hunting activists on the opening morning. The media lapped up these stunts, and for the first time the whole duck opening issue was turned into a joke. This allowed FGA spokesmen to get their points across and FGA began to receive equal airtime on the whole issue. The anti-hunters no longer had the media all to themselves. These tactics worked, and the great duck opening debate became a yearly media giggle. Within a matter of years, the media interest in duck season waned, as the general public became tired of the same old story and realised that it was just a bit of a circus after all. Field and Game was also successful in getting the government to introduce human safety regulations that prohibited protesters from the wetlands at specified times on opening weekend, and also prohibited them from approaching hunters within certain distances for the remainder of the season. Protesters were regularly being charged by police, and over the years the number of protesters attending the duck opening dwindled to an insignificant amount. In the early days, VF and GA branches across the state began building clay target shooting grounds. This was a means to foster friendship, improve shooting skills, and to create a social atmosphere where shooters could gather outside of the game seasons. A special type of clay target shooting discipline was developed called simulated field. The first competition was held at Ballarat in 1961. The Listerfield Shooting School was officially opened by the Governor, Sir Owen Delacombe, on the 11th of November 1972. Clay target shooting boomed during the late 80s and still continues to grow today. The relaxed social atmosphere of simulated field shooting did not replace but enhanced a day in the field. Many close friendships and bonds were formed. These bonds have formed a network of people who now work closely together to protect their privilege to own guns and hunt. An annual shoot book is produced and distributed to every member so that they know where the shooting grounds are and when they shoot. This encourages further member participation in the sport. Simulated field shooting has now grown to the stage where there are over 45 shooting grounds, and a national carnival is held annually, where up to 500 shooters attend, making it the largest single shooting competition in Australia. The association created a new portfolio called Game Management during the early 90s. This had to be done to liaise with the new Game Management Unit that had been created by the Department of Conservation and Lands. Immediately it set about conducting research into duck numbers, coordinating waterfowl counts and the effects of lead shot. The lack of proper game management from the previous governments of the 80s and early 90s had forced the association into this complex field. More and more, it seemed that the VF and GA's workload and responsibilities in this field would never stop expanding. In 2007, the first FGA board member completed the game management course run by the University of Queensland, further enhancing the professionalism of the association's work. The benefit of a well-trained gun dog as a tool for humanely retrieving game, and the fact that over 60% of members own gun dogs, resulted in the Field and Game holding a 2-day gun dog training seminar in 1992. This was extremely well attended and resulted in further training days and seminars being held around the country. Close liaison with gun dog clubs helped create a system where FGA members could be tested under retrieving trial conditions for their FGA Retriever Test Certificate. Several FGA Retriever tests are now held throughout the year, and a 2-day trial takes place every August for the FGA Shield. Communication with members had started with rudimentary information sheets and newsletters in the early days. 1966 saw the Port Phillip region introduce a 15-page news in buff with black motif. This lasted until August 1974, when it became black and white with spot colour. In February 1978, the news was twice the size and had a colour cover. It included all branches and regions and was now sent to all members throughout the state. In February 1983, the Field and Game news went to quarto size. The Field and Game news served the association well until 1994, when it was decided that the association had to upgrade the magazine and develop a newsstand presence. For some years, the association had been trying to outsource the magazine without success. Communications took a leap forward in 1995 when Feathers and Fur magazine was launched onto newsstands across Australia. Field and Game adopted this magazine as its means of communicating with members, and also to highlight its activities to hunters that were not members. Hunter conservationists from around the country who had not known of Field and Game could now see the benefits of membership. Field and Game was no longer viewed as a secret society, and its activities and ideals were now on display for all to see. The first year of publication saw a huge lift in new members as a result of the new magazine. It is now a full colour production and continues to educate, entertain and represent members today. In 1996, Field and Game held the inaugural Branch Duck Hunt Challenge. This was designed to show that hunters were tourists and of economical value to regional and rural Australia. The first event was held on the 11th and 12th of May 1996, with just under 100 members attending. Every year, the event got bigger, and by the 2002 event at Seaspray, over 500 people had to be catered for at the Saturday night function.
The Duck Hunt Challenge idea came about not to create a hunt for duck hunters and not to get a heap of hunters together in one spot so you kept the birds going or anything like that. The whole concept of the Duck Hunt Challenge was to show that we as hunters were beneficial to rural communities as tourists. We as hunters were beneficial to rural communities as part of those communities. So, because at the time, one of the moves with the anti-hunting groups was to turn our wetlands into sanctuaries so all the tourists could go and look at the wildlife. Well, when they can feed a duck at the Botanical Gardens in Melbourne, I can't imagine anyone going up to a mosquito-infested, tiger snake-ridden swamp on the Gumbow Creek anywhere. So it was just fanciful. But that image had been brought up, so we needed to show that we were part of the community and a valuable part. So we came up with the idea of a duck hunt challenge, and that created a team competitive activity amongst branches and hunters.
The last Branch Duck Hunt Challenge was held at Wangaratta in 2005, with participants coming from as far away as Darwin. Drought and closed seasons has stopped any further events taking place since then. The eve of the first Branch Duck Hunt Challenge also brought a huge body blow to firearm owners across Australia. Friday the 10th of May 1996 was the infamous Police Ministers' Conference held after the Port Arthur tragedy. Prime Minister John Howard announced that all semi-automatic firearms and pump-action shotguns would be banned. It was estimated that over 85% of Field and Game members use these types of firearms. This resulted in Field and Game having to represent its members in meetings with federal government as well as state government agencies. Marches, rallies and demonstrations were organised throughout the country. Media commitments were intense, and the campaign to save self-loading and pump-action shotguns was enormous, using up the organisation's funds and manpower. At the end of it all, the fight to save self-loading and pump-action shotguns was lost. What were called national uniform gun laws were introduced across the country. The only problem was that every state was totally different. There was nothing uniform at all except the ban on self-loading and pump-action shotguns. Over the next decade, this forced Field and Game to get heavily into the realm of politics. Several members stood as candidates for the newly formed Shooters Party and Country Alliance. The foray into the world of politics has met with success, as the shooters' vote is now recognised as an important one that has the ability to win or lose seats under the right conditions. In New South Wales, the Shooters Party obtained 2 seats in the upper house. Country Alliance was credited with stopping the Greens from gaining control of the Victorian upper house in the 2006 Victorian election, and both parties have had an effect on federal government seats in consequent elections. Changes to firearm laws that are reasonable and acceptable to firearms owners are gradually being implemented in most states, as the anti-gun related hysteria of 1996 is recognised as being a failure and a non-working bureaucratic nightmare. It took over 10 years of long, hard work, but some sensibilities began to come back into the various states' regulations. There is still no semblance of national uniformity though. In response to all the federally motivated anti-gun activity, changes had to be made. state bodies could no longer cope. The Victorian Field and Game Association became a national body in 1998 and changed its name to Field and Game Australia, and embarked on a membership recruitment campaign that involved television advertising.
Victorian Field and Game Association promotes ethical hunting activities, clay target shooting, wetland protection and game management. Membership is a genuine reason for retaining your firearms licence. Join the Field and Game now.
During the entire life of the association, branches have conducted field hunts on duck, foxes, hares and rabbits. The frequency of these events depended on the branch localities and the availability of hunting habitat. In recent times, the exploding fox population and the public acceptance for the need to cull them has brought about a revival in organised field hunts. Field and Game members are increasingly being called upon by government agencies, local authorities and commercial interests to assist in fox and other pest animal control programs. Members have helped the University of Western Australia to collect fox DNA samples across Australia in the hope of combating the ever-increasing fox populations and the damage that they inflict on native wildlife. The most unfortunate and disappointing aspect of the influence of anti-hunting and anti-gun movements over the last 2 decades has been the diversion of funds and manpower from saving wetlands and other conservation activities. Field and Game has had to spend the last 20 years trying to save conservation hunters from extinction, as well as trying to save wetlands and water birds. The association has stuck to its base principles though, and in 2001 it formed the Wetland Environmental Task Force Public Fund, or WET, a federal government approved charitable environmental trust. The formation of WET recognised the desperate need to preserve and maintain Australia's remaining wetlands and the essential habitat that they provide for a wide variety of unique native flora and fauna. WET offers every Australian, not just FGA members, an opportunity to take positive action to protect and enhance Australia's wetlands. It was formed by Field and Game Australia to provide a vehicle for funding the acquisition, rehabilitation and maintenance of Australian wetlands. Wetlands acquired by the Trust will be managed in accordance with the wise use principles of the Ramsar Convention, known as Ramsar. The first wetland purchased by WET was the Hart Morass, a 1930-acre wetland in Sale, Victoria. Over $1 million was raised by WET through the generous donations of FGA branches, individual members and the Hugh Williamson Foundation. A management program is in place that will rehabilitate the Hart Morass after years of grazing and saltwater inundation. It is fitting that 50 years after the formation of Field and Game in Sale, so as to save wetlands, that such an important and iconic wetland has now been purchased as a freehold asset rather than a government reserve. It's well worth remembering the motto that the first members of Field and Game adopted as their slogan.
In fact, when the association was formed, it adopted a motto, a quote from King George VI of England, and it said, "The wildlife of today is not ours to dispose of as we please. We have it in trust. We must account for it to those who come after."
After 50 years, Field and Game Australia now has 62 branches with 14,000 members. The future, beginning from 2009, will hopefully bring another 50 years of prosperity and success to Field and Game throughout Australia.